All right, well, I'm going to kick things off. My name is Jackie Hoffert, and I use, oh, here we go. Let's get one more person in before I go to my little screen here.
Yay, it's Isabella.
Oh, great. Hi, Isabella.
Sorry, Jackie.
No problem. Um, yeah, my name is Jackie Hoffert. I use they and them pronouns, and I work for Massy Art Society as the event and administrative coordinator. I am a fourth generation settler of mixed German, Mennonite, and Irish ancestry. The family names that I descend from are the Hofferts, the Grosses, the Yankees, and the Bachmans on my father's side, and the Peters, Dukes, Sullivans, and Krikows on my mother's side. My family is spread across Treaty 4 territory, where I was born in Regina, and Treaty 6, where my parents were born in Saskatoon, and Treaty 7 territory, where my parents live now in Calgary. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which Massy Arts operates and that I'm privileged to call home and have on and off for 23 years is the unceded territory of the Coast Salish peoples, including the territories of the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh nations. Massy Art Society is a community hub dedicated to supporting the practices of Indigenous and over-excluded artists. And our programming is extensive in its multiple forms. We have open talks, debates, book launches, art shows, performances, concerts, fairs, and others. To keep up to date with our extensive programming, I recommend you follow us on social media or sign up for our newsletter, and I'll put the link into the chat. But that's it from me. I'm going to pass you over now to Heige.
Hi, everyone. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm on the unceded territory of the Squamish Nation. Thank you, Jackie, Massy Art Society, Jen, and all of you guys. Over to you, Jen.
Thanks. I'm also on the unceded territory of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh, and not very far from where my family lived on the Mission Reserve. So I'm going to get started by saying hello, everybody. It's nice to see some familiar faces. Isabella. And I'm just going to do a little bit of housekeeping, how the night will go. Heige and I are pretty well scripted, so if you see us pick up our papers or anything, just so we don't forget anything. We're going to start with talking a little bit about the importance of story, and then we're going to alternate readings and questions for each other, followed by an audience Q&A. So please, as we're going along, feel free to write your questions in the chat, and we'll get back to them at the end of the talk. If you feel triggered by tonight's talk, please feel free to reach out to a helpline or a residential school helpline. I know these topics can be difficult, especially for survivors, and we're going to be as gentle as possible. And just now, I'm going to put some numbers for you in the chat. And I'll refer you back to these at the end of the talk as well. If we have any time left, we'll talk about some upcoming projects and some other general fun stuff. About halfway through, after Heige's section, we're going to have maybe a 5-minute bio break if you want to have a drink of water or just absorb. And I guess that's it. So let me just turn this off and ask Heige. Heige, why is storytelling important to you?
I read somewhere that without stories, there would be no language. I'd like to add there would be no consciousness and also no dreams. Not knowing stories robs people of history. Not knowing our stories creates isolation and doesn't allow us to root. We lose connection to ourselves and others. All imagination and creation would be lost. Living without stories for me would be like living without hope. Jen, why is storytelling important to you?
Thanks for asking. First of all, I agree with everything you said, and I would like to add that storytelling is important to me because it's one of my voices. I use it to communicate when I can't in other ways. I'm a very fairly solitary person, so I do love to sit and read or write, and I'm terrible at social situations, so telling stories is also a way of making friends. Having said that, storytelling is important to me because it's how I learn about everything from other people and cultures to my own. It helps me break down barriers by increasing my understanding.
Nice. What Jen and I are not here to do is tell people how to tackle reconciliation. However, we can talk about our stories. My story is about growing up in Germany with two parents who were children during the Nazi regime. Jen will tell her story of growing up away from her culture. So yes,
Would you like to start with your story
yeah,
and your intro?
yeah. So my name's Heige Boehm. I'm the author of the novel Secrets in the Shadows. I'm the host of the podcast A Writer's Life, the founder and writing guide instructor of the educational writing workshop Crow Story House. I'm a political armchair essayist and a World War II history buff. I hold a creative writing certificate from the Writers Studio of Simon Fraser University and a liberal arts 55 plus certificate from Simon Fraser University. I'm also a certified guided autobiography instructor from the Bjorn Center for Autobiographical Studies. And I'm finishing my second novel, Black Earth, a companion book to Secrets in the Shadows. I have about 80 pages left.
Yay.
Why I wrote Secrets in the Shadows. The short answer is I needed to know my father's life stories. On September 9th, 1983, my father was murdered in Austin, Texas. All his stories were lost to me. I was 18 years old and left to navigate a minefield of grief. And without a map to guide me, I became depressed, lost, and angry. I wanted to know why he was the complex man he had become. I knew very little about his life, his inner world, or his inner thoughts, and nothing about his childhood. I knew he was born in 1933, Germany, the year Hitler rose to power, and he lived for 12 years in a totalitarian state. And after World War II, he lived for 14 years under Russian communist rule in East Germany. To understand my father, I created a fictional story about him, and in turn, I began to heal. That's why I wrote my novel. And the story, Secrets in the Shadows, tells the story of best friends Michael and Wolfie, who are caught up in the fanatical enthusiasm of the Third Reich ideology in the 1930s. Their safe world turns upside down as their lives unravel. And as one secret is exposed, another is born. The part that I'll read is where Michael and Wolfie are about to board a train and head to a Nazi training camp. They get picked up by the Gestapo and driven out to the Zimmerman's farm, and horrors are sure to follow. So I will read that part. Just get that. So the man named Potmark is a Gestapo agent. I directed the driver along the old Cliffstrasse, the winding back road that led to the Zimmerman's house. The hazelnut grove was to our right, and to our left stood the remnants of the apple orchard that once had branches bursting with blossoms, but now was a field of burnt and broken trunks. Frau Zimmermann, who was carrying a pail of milk, saw the car approaching and walked quickly toward the house, calling for her husband. Just as Herr Zimmermann opened the door, we stepped out of the Totenwagen. Liebchen, the German shepherd, stood between Herr and Frau Zimmermann. Its ears were back and its teeth bared. Herr Zimmermann studied the two officials standing beside us, while his wife stood holding her pail of fresh milk. As she wiped her free hand on her mustard-colored apron, she said calmly, "Hello, Michael and Wolfie." Herr Zimmermann reached down to hold Liebchen by her collar, as by now the dog was growling. "Can I help you?" "You are Herr Isaac Zimmermann?" "Yeah." "Is everything all right?" "We have orders to bring you to the Reich Security Office," said Pockmark. "May I ask regarding what?" Gestapo man reached for Herr Zimmermann's arm, but Liebchen went to lunge at the Gestapo man, and Herr Zimmermann pulled back on her collar. "We have our orders," said Pockmark. If you don't want to be arrested, I suggest you come with us at once. Frau Zimmermann turned to her husband. Best you do as you're told. Herr Zimmermann nodded, and she bent to take Liebchen's collar from him. But at that moment, Liebchen broke free and began running across the grass. Gestapo man turned, and we all spotted a small, dark-haired child running into the barn. Who is that? Potmark asked. Before any of us could say or do anything, he pulled out his whistle and began blowing it as he ran after the child. The other Gestapo man stopped briefly at the Totenwagen and grabbed a pair of semi-automatic machine guns from the trunk, slung them over his shoulder, and then followed him, yelling, Halt! Halt! I turned to Frau Zimmermann, but before I could ask her anything, she dropped the pail of milk, spilling it over the doorstep, and ran after the two men. Herr Zimmermann said, The children. Wolfie and I ran toward the barn, not knowing what would happen. When we bolted into the barn, we saw at the far end Liebchen barking wildly, and she had placed herself between the child and Pockmark. He pulled out his pistol, shot Liebchen, then grabbed the child by the hair and dangled her in the air. As the girl screamed, she clasped her hand around her head, trying to release herself from his grasp. Her dark brown eyes frantically searching the room for help. That's that.
Thanks very much. I have some questions for you, if that's all right.
Yay.
So I know what it's like to write like this, and you must have done a ton of research on World War II. How did you go about that, and what were some of the challenges that you encountered?
My mother was born in 1933, the year World War II broke out. She and her family fled from the advancing Red Army. After the war, she found herself locked behind the Iron Curtain, East Germany. I grew up hearing her war stories, and it was through those stories that I first learned about the horror and cruelty of war. I spent 10 years researching World War II and writing my novel. I pored over history books. I interviewed former SS soldiers, and I watched a lot of documentaries. I corresponded with two war historians, and I also researched trips back to Germany, interviewing my German relatives, and asked a lot of questions. Questions are always great to ask. But it was my mother's war stories that fed my imagination and gave me the courage to work through emotions and feelings that I was having. Through my mother's stories, I gained a deeper compassion for her and my father. Once, when I interviewed her, she seemed angry. This was so interesting to me. And I suddenly realized that she carried guilt and shame along with feeling responsible for Hitler's atrocities. I told her she had nothing to feel guilty about, nor was it her fault, that she had been a child and, in fact, had been a victim of Nazi Germany herself. She had never heard someone say those words to her, and I can still picture her. I believe at that moment she began a journey for her. I like to think she healed a little and was reconciled with some of her past. And in 1944, my grandfather and his son, my uncle, were forced to join the folk army. This is towards the end of the war. Both were captured fairly early, 1944, and my grandfather spent 5 years after the war in a POW camp. I interviewed Edward Krawinckel, who had been a SS boy soldier, a paratrooper, and a sniper. And through his stories, I understood how ordinary people can commit horrendous and heinous crimes. When I wrote my novel, I realized that my parents had lived their whole lives with PTSD. I gained insight into generational trauma and the effects it brings. When my mother was 26, my grandfather committed suicide 1 month before I was born. And later in life, my mother 3 times tried to commit suicide, and I almost attempted it too. My father missed out on an education because of the war. He couldn't read or write. He had to work to bring money home. And at 17, he volunteered to fight in Korea with the French Foreign Legion. He had a violent temper and spent time in jail. And in 1961, he almost beat a Russian diplomat to death. Because of that, he and my mother had to escape East Germany, leaving their families behind. They escaped with two of my sisters, but that's a completely other story. I had to come to terms with Germany's dark history, and as well as that of my family, along with my feelings of guilt and shame for being born German.
Wow, that's super harsh. How did you reconcile your own feelings of guilt and shame and get to where you are now?
I realized that it wasn't my shame and guilt to carry. I think it was through watching some program, and somebody had said that. So that really stuck with me. But what happened for me, I started asking a lot of questions like, why did German people follow a madman? How and why does the totalitarian government come to power? And why do its citizens lose their moral compasses and carry out orders of a fascist government? And one of the big questions also was, who benefits from an immoral government? Not only did I find the answers, but I began examining my personal beliefs and started viewing the action of people and government through a different lens. First, what I had to do was really acknowledge how I felt. That was uncomfortable. And with that, I reflected on moments in my life where guilt and shame had begun. I reflected on the first time I had felt bad for being German, and it was the first few days of being in school. It was when my family and I moved to Canada in 1974. I was 9, and kids at school threw rocks at me, called me Hitler, a Nazi, and a Jew killer. That was the beginning of me feeling guilty for being German and for the Jewish genocide. Like my mother, I too felt responsible for World War II. And that started, I started to really hate myself, and my self-esteem started to sink. I desperately wanted to fit in. I became angry. Those encounters left me not wanting to speak German. I lost the ability to speak my mother tongue, and that left me not able to speak to my father or know his stories. He never learned English. My mother did, though. By the time I was in grade 7, I started using drugs to numb my feelings. I left school at the age of 16. And one of the reasons was because, like my father, I had trouble with the English language. I moved out of the family home and became a hairdresser. I still am a hairdresser. Slowly, I started to build self-worth and take steps to understand my mother and father. It was through my mother's stories that I pieced together her life and was able to imagine my father's life. And it was really their stories that began the journey for me to reconcile my feelings of guilt and shame. I also learned again how to speak German. I researched what actions Germany had and is still taking to atone for the atrocities committed by the Nazi government and its willing and unwilling accomplices of that time.
This is what we often talk about when you and I get together, and I'm really curious to know what some of the steps that Germany has taken and is still taking to reconcile with the Holocaust victims and their heirs. I think we can probably learn a lot from this.
Yeah, it was interesting because through the research, I tried to find a lot of stuff, and I came upon the Just Act report. And so I'm just going to read some of
Mhm.
what Germany has done and is still doing. And
Mhm.
I found it really quite interesting. From 1945 to 2018, the German, and it's still ongoing, the German government paid approximately $86.8 billion in restitution and compensation to the Holocaust victims and their heirs. Germany has also identified Nazi looted objects, including artworks, books, and objects within large collections, and has returned over 16,000 objects to survivors and their heirs over the last 20 years. And they're still really looking and returning found looted art remains, and that's an ongoing process.
Mhm.
Both the federal and the state government provide funding to preserve Holocaust memorials, including former concentration camps and Jewish sites of cultural or religious importance. Germany holds numerous annual commemoration events throughout the country at memorials and the sites of former concentration camps. Holocaust remembrance is also an integral part of public school education throughout Germany. I think they started at around grade 5 or 6 that they really start talking about the Holocaust. And students often visit one of the 12 former concentration camps in Germany that are now Holocaust commemoration sites. Reconciliation for Germany is an ongoing process. And, we can't erase or forget the truth and the horrors of genocide, but I believe it's through stories that we can understand the truth and be part of the solution to create a kinder world. And with that, I'll read a short excerpt from my next novel, Black Earth. It's not published yet, and it's also a working title. The part I'll read is where the protagonist, Paula, a nurse, is leaving her home to travel to Ukraine. Hello, Paula. Wolfie unlatched the back gate and walked toward me. I bent down and picked a dandelion and twirled it between my fingers. Hello, Wolfie. Wolfie smiled, revealing his dimples. I knew he had been watching for me. He did that often. I didn't mind. I came to say goodbye. He stood tall, his shoulders square and back. He wore his Hitler Jugend uniform with pride. I handed him the yellow flower. He took it and put it in his shirt pocket. I'll miss you. I won't miss this place, I said. It's not that bad here. You want out as bad as I do. Don't pretend otherwise. Yeah. When will you come home? Hopefully, never. There's nothing here for me. Wolfie cocked his head and under his breath said, Nothing? His red curly hair flopped over his green eyes. You know what I mean. I get it, Paula, but remember, there are some good things here too. The train that morning smelled of wet newspaper, dust, and smoke. I placed my one bag beside me on the wooden bench for the 1-hour train ride and turned to stare out the window at my family waving me off. The train began moving. I glanced back at what I knew, but I couldn't be more relieved to be starting over. I felt a small tug at my heart, but I quickly buried that feeling. A sign mounted on the red brick wall read, Schadesdorf. I closed my eyes and began to think about my traveling arrangements. Once in Dresden, I'd have to transfer onto the Berlin train. I would be on that train for 2 days, heading to Ukraine. I didn't relish that thought. What would I do? I opened my eyes and rummaged through my bag, searching for my blue notebook. Ah, here it is. I placed it on the bench beside me and noticed the little going-away gift that Mama had placed in my bag. All she had said was, I know you have dreams. I held the present that she had wrapped in newspaper and used twine to secure it. I pulled at the string and watched as the bow came undone. The paper fell to the side, revealing a box with the words Pelican written on top. Gently, I lifted the lid and gasped at seeing the red fountain pen, the one that had been in the Tanten Emma Laden window. Mama had watched me eyeing it. She must have saved for a long time to buy it. Papa controlled all the money. I opened the book, and as I felt the crispness of the blank pages, excitement gripped me. I held my breath and thought, adventures will grace these pages. Gently, I took the cap off my new pen, gave it a quick shake to push the ink into the writing tip. That's it.
Thank you. I'm wondering, because we're so good for time, if there's any questions for you now that maybe you want to answer while everything is still fresh. Would that be all right?
Mm.
If anybody's got any questions for Heige? I have one. I'm just wondering, really, it would be so interesting to know if, kids are learning about the Holocaust at that young age, how it's presented to them. it seems such a hard thing. I don't know if you know anything about that.
I don't because I left after grade 3, and I know that my sisters at the time were in grade 6 and grade 7, and
Mhm.
they knew already about the Holocaust. And I would imagine they start slowly into it. I don't think they just go boom, here you go.
Yeah, yeah,
But I'm actually not sure about it.
that'd be interesting. I'm definitely gonna look that up.
Yeah, it would be.
Isabella?
Yeah, I don't know if you would like to hear my experience with this.
Yes, please.
Sure.
So, as the two of you know, I'm German. I grew up in Germany, and I'm, I guess, a little bit older than Heige. It wasn't really until I was late in high school that people started talking about the Holocaust. However, I grew up with gazillions of stories about that because my parents were resistors, and my best friend was her parents were Holocaust survivors. But what I do remember is having an impassioned pacifist religion teacher in grade 3, and she thought that she needed to let us know about bad things that can happen. And one morning, she said, "I'm going to show you a movie," and she showed us the movie of Hiroshima.
Wow.
And then something similar happened in my first year of German high school, which is grade 5, where they showed us movies about World War One. So I would imagine that it probably took a little while until people figured out that that's not the way to go about it. It was extremely traumatizing.
Yeah, I'd also like to say there is a level of awareness, obviously. Like for me, I lived across a World War II war bunker. And so, and because of my mother's stories, everywhere you go in Germany, there's memorial sites everywhere, and there's still remnants of the war. When we would go visit East Germany, East Germany didn't do a lot to clean up war. They would just put gates or fences around sites that were still bombed out, and so there was bullet holes in the walls. You'd had the Russian soldiers be guarding certain areas, and they'd be walking around with machine guns, semi-automatic rifles. So it's there and it's present, but and so for me, because of my mother's stories, my father never said anything. I actually really learned. I thought war happened at night. Army tanks would drive down our road at night, and so I would see that. And based with my mother's war stories, I actually always thought war was at night. So there is a knowing for sure. Christine, I think you said you had a question. You have to unmute yourself. Jackie, can you unmute her? You're muted as well, Jackie.
I can only, oh, there we go.
Oh, there you go.
Okay. Yeah, I just wanted to ask you, I'm listening right now to a book, All the Light We Cannot
All the
See.
lights you cannot see. Yep.
And just today I was listening to it, and I'm listening to the audio book, So certainly I'm trying to take in what these children are experiencing. And but I wanted to ask you specifically, this is all new to me. I only know, I live in San Francisco. I only know as much as I know, about the Holocaust and about that. about World War II, et cetera, et cetera. But I certainly know what's going on in our present day in the United States. And anyway, I wanted to ask you, your mother, you continue to say her stories, you know, what I know is from my mother's stories.
Yeah.
If you had to narrow down one predominant feeling or that she shared with you, or her whole, you know, perspective on all that whole time, how would you describe that about your mother? How did
Right.
Yeah.
So there isn't a time that I don't not remember her war stories. And in the beginning, she would always just say, you know, the Russians came and we had to march through the woods, and we lived, and mom made a big pot of potato salad and strung it over. And so she would tell me her stories without much emotion attached
see.
to it. And what happened later on, she kept telling those stories. And so growing up, you're just like, oh, there she goes again, talking about the war. And later on in life, once I really started to get interested in World War II, I started asking her to tell me those stories again, and I would record them. And then what happened once was she was talking about being in the forest and seeing dead people on the side of the road. And so I said to her, gee, mom, that must have been really frightening for you. And she goes, no, you just did it. And then she would tell me the story again. And the next time she told me the story, she would say things like, you know, it freaked me out and it made me cry and I was really scared. And so I think by somebody, you can tell people stories, but are they truly listening? And so I think she started to feel that she was actually listened to. And, you know, later on, I started to think that's why she kept telling the stories, because she didn't feel heard. And finally, she felt heard. And so we were able to have a lot of conversations around each story that she told me. She was able to allow herself to feel part of it. She never read my book because she said it was too triggering for her. And so, you know, that was, yeah.
And so you could see that she was both scared and angry during that whole period of time.
Yeah, I think as she got older, you know, and especially because she's living in Germany and she was under Russian occupation, where that's a whole other thing. You just get on with it. You just do what you have to do. And that's what she did. And so, but she kept telling the stories because she was a child, you know, when this all happened. So for her to process that, and people not actually engaging in dialogue, I believe she couldn't organize and truly allow herself to feel some of that. And I don't think you never can, I think, with something that horrific, be in that place for very long.
Thank you.
You're muted, Jen.
Karen had a question, I think.
You're muted, Karen.
I think she asked, did you use any personal stories in your novel?
Oh yeah, a lot of it. I used childhood stories. There's a part where Michael and Wolfie would play cops and robbers and or Robin Hood. And what they did is they would make bows and arrows and take their elastics out of their underpants and tie it to the bow. And actually, we as children, I have 5 sisters, that's what we would do. Take the elastics out from the underpants and go and shoot at each other with the bows and arrows. And so our underpants would always fall off, and mom would be saying, why do you guys not have any elastics in your underpants? What's wrong with that? And why are all my kitchen knives dull? Because we'd sit and we'd sharpen for arrows. And there's another really great part where mom, when she she had bought her first pair of blue shoes, and she was playing out in the back court, and there was a bunch of outhouses, and so the septic tanks were, I guess that outhouse must have been moved, and so it wasn't properly covered in the ground, and she was swinging up top, and she fell in, and so she lost her blue shoes, and her brother had to come and rescue her, and obviously she had to wash and clean to go. It was a dance she was going to, and so I thought, oh, that's such a great story. So I used that Wolfie had fallen into the tank. So I've woven, in some harder parts for sure. Edward Krawinkle, he had told me some stories, and so I put that in there. I had asked him, if there was no food, how did you get food? And one of the things that he said is they would go, when they were in small towns, what they would do is they would find a cat and cut its throat and then drag the blood through the town so that the dogs would sniff at it, and then they would kill the dogs and eat them because there was no food. So yeah, there is real accounts in there, and obviously I've fictionalized them as well. Thanks for that question.
Thanks, Heige. I'm wondering if we want to take just a few minutes to get up and stretch and everything before I continue on with my bit, if that sounds okay with everybody. 5 minutes maybe. Do you want to come back at 6:46? That sounds okay? Okay. Okay, just let me grab my notes. Is everybody back? I think so. Just let me close this chat window here. Where is it? Okay. All right. So now for part 2 of our show. So here's my little bit. I'm Jenn Ashton, and I'm a writer, an artist, a local historian, and a filmmaker here in North Vancouver. I've just finished a year studying at Oxford University, and this summer I'm working on some script writing for a television anthology based on my next book. I'm also in the middle of moving house, and it is certainly one of the top 5 stressors. Hence, we've got this night scripted out, so I don't have to think too hard. I want to add in here that Heige and I met in the writer's studio in 2019, and along with Isabella. And we spent an amazing year working with our mentor, Stella Harvey. And I can't say enough about the program. I was first published when I was around 14, but I never felt like a real writer until I'd been through this program, just learning the mechanics of the profession. And of course, making like-minded friends was epic. I always thought being a writer was a solo effort, but it's really not. So if you want to, also please ask us anything about the program, and we'll tell you all about it because it was amazing. But back on topic. For my reading tonight, I can begin by saying that I had no plan to write this story. Just like all the stories in my book, People Like Frank and Other Stories from the Edge of Normal, they were written as part of National Novel Writing Month, and instead of writing a novel, I decided to write a short story or a piece of flash fiction every day. And the publisher liked that idea, so that was great. My stories usually come out as a stream of consciousness unless I'm writing for a reason. For example, a magazine column with a set criteria or theme, and I think that's how I process my life, is writing in that way. Sometimes I don't understand what my stories mean until after I've written them. This piece that I'm going to read you, part of this piece, it feels homey for me, and it's also based on some facts, so maybe leaning a little hard towards creative nonfiction. It reminds me of my family and how detached we were from the generation who raised us. And the story is called All Nation Soup. My granny used to make this thing called all nation soup. It was basically hamburger soup, but it had 4 kinds of beans in it. I think she just made it up from what she had. We had it every Sunday at her house when all of our parents dumped us off to go and do whatever they did on a Sunday afternoon. I'm pretty sure it was not to go to church. Sorry, Helen. I think my mother went to work and my father to the bar, or maybe they just all went back to bed, happy to be rid of us for a few hours. All of the cousins would be there, the aunts and the uncles driving up in a queue outside the old apartment block, some nodding to each other from the driver's seat, and others hungover and ignoring everybody. We would all rush up to the glass doors with the big words Regent Manor in gold writing. It was always a race to see who could push the buzzer, and then we'd lean against the dirty white stucco and feel the sharp glass pieces through our t-shirts, jean jackets, and windbreakers, and wait for Granny to buzz us in. The first thing we would do was huddle in the kitchen and watch Granny stir the soup pot and start to build up that soup. The dank smell of beans, when the pot reached a boil, would hit our noses before she would put the other ingredients in. That's the way it's done, she'd say. You have to start with nothing and build it into something. That's where the magic is. First you have nothing, and then you have something. And she would wave her wooden spoon with a flourish like a wand and smile her gummy smile, her gray perm bobbing as she laughed, while she slowly moved around the small kitchen, the arthritis already having taken firm hold of her small, stout 65-year-old frame. We had heard different versions of this every Sunday for as long as I can remember, but Granny's lessons were never boring, and usually combined a recipe of some sort with a bit of family history, and most times a moral tacked on the end, just to keep us pure. Now that I'm grown up, I know how long she must have spent making that soup for us, because beans take a long time to make. I know she must have had patience and so much love for us to make that special thing for all of us kids every Sunday. We would roll in, 10 of us more or less, and get dumped off around 2 or 3 in the afternoon. We'd kind of bum around until supper time, when we would all sit around the old table. Granny would have put the leaf in before we arrived, just in case our full count of 15 ever showed. We never did, except Easter, Christmas, and her birthday. And she always put out the nice, freshly pressed linen tablecloth for us, and we got to use the good old-fashioned roses china and the forks and knives out of the locked wooden box from the bottom of the china cabinet. Special things should be used every day because every day is special, she would remind whoever was helping her set the table that day. We would always fight over who got to help her with the preparations. It felt grown up to do things like fold and smooth the white napkins. Reverent. Now that I know that's how they do it in a fancy restaurant, I know that Granny was trying to make us all feel special, and we did, even though sometimes we didn't know it at the time. Sometimes Bill kicked us under the table, and Roger always had a drippy nose and didn't care what he ate. The steam just made his nose run more. Anne-Marie was always reading, but she'd put down her book when Granny would go around the table, holding the big pot with her green check tea towel, ladling soup for us, and her bowl was full. Granny served that soup like it was her only job, and we were kings and queens, not just grubby kids. She radiated love at us, and it was sometimes the only soul food we got all week. Most of our parents worked, and that meant for us older kids we were left to fend for ourselves for supper. And most of the younger ones were on a regular diet of frozen TV dinners, which were all the rage. When I look back now, I'm sure that these warm and caring Sundays with Granny were what kept us going in the swiftly evolving 70s, where families were no longer like the Waltons we saw on TV, but instead a minefield of changing ideas and ideals.
Nice.
Thanks.
A beautiful story.
Thank you.
I'm going to make some bean soup. When you introed this piece, I was wondering what you meant by detached from the people who raised you. I'm assuming you meant your parents.
Yeah. My parents, although both my parents worked, that wasn't the real detachment. I think it was, well, I can sum it up by a quote that I read the other day, which said, "Every single one of your First Nations friends are either a residential school survivor, a survivor's child, or a grandchild, or all three." I'm not sure who wrote that, but it's valid, and it speaks to the separation of my family and culture. One of my ancestor grannies was one of the first residents at St. Mary's School. and she was there for a decade. I don't know how she did it. The program was pretty successful at wiping out connection to our family and culture. And then down the line, there has been that evolving dissociation through more residential school and Indian day schools with from everybody.
Mhm.
I was separated from my entire First Nations family growing up, and have spent the better part of the last 10 years coming home with my dad, which has been amazing.
Mhm.
I think the story speaks to the bits and pieces of connection that we had and what we could find and where we found it. Those Sunday nights and just the routine of that, being at my grandma's, really connected me. Yeah.
Wow. Wow.
It.
How does this story relate to our topic of reconciliation and story?
Yeah, I think it relates in that I found that in order to proceed with reconciliation on a grand scale and work towards that, I needed to process and deal with reconciliation in myself and with my family first. In my book, I do process this in each story. In the last story, I do come home to myself. Um, and this reflects my life during this period. And I'll talk about the outcome of it in my next reading, which is a poem. But back to this excerpt, the story is an example of sharing part of myself with the world, or at least anybody who reads it. I think that maybe you or anybody can find some common ground here. Maybe you lived in the 70s. Maybe you had cousins. Maybe you spent Sundays with your grandma, or maybe you just remember that sharp feeling of stucco. So those things can join us together. And that's you and me finding common ground because of story. And finding common ground is the place where reconciliation, I think, really begins to unfold. So it's a really, really one-to-one kind of a deal.
True.
Mm-hmm.
Why do we bother reconciling anything at all?
Well, that's a good question. I feel that to have a healthy working community, a world community or a small community that is working towards closing gaps and providing equity and equality for everybody, all of its members. That is to say, being free to celebrate the individual that they are, their history and their culture without fear of judgment or punishment. We all need to work on reconciling our issues within ourselves and at all levels of relationship and administration, for example, all different levels of government and everybody that's involved in our communities. I'm not sure every person in a society or community can live their best life without reconciling on some level, because until we have that, I'm not sure that we truly have peace. And from my perspective, peace in this world is certainly a goal of most people, I think, I hope. I know for myself, I hate having a bad feeling inside of myself. And my history has certainly shown that when I can reconcile my own feelings, just myself or with another person, I'm more able to step forward and work towards finding that common ground with somebody else. The word itself, reconciliation, really used to bug me. I used to hate it. I used to call it the R word. I used to hate it. But because the definition is like putting two pieces back together, but these pieces were never together in the first place. So that really used to bug me. But now I've changed that definition, and in my head, I think I've kind of found a way to deal with it. And what it means to me, really, the word is a way forward and a way to reach a peaceful place. And I think we need to look at it in terms of that, and stop throwing rocks in our path, really. Yeah. So,
Well said.
thank you. What I want to read for you now, though, is something that I just wrote, which kind of shows where I'm at now, after kind of my own process of reconciliation after all these years with my family and myself. So I've just finished school, and for the most part of the whole last year, I've been looking at census documents like crazy from everywhere. And one line that really stood out for me was one of the little tick mark boxes that says R is for red, and which of course in that context meant Indian. And that gave me the idea for this poem. So it's called R is for Red. My genes have come alive like stars, a sun sparkle running on water, where I've slowly wandered for 60 years long and wide. With urgency, pings awaken me and stick me to the ground. When I've smelled warm hide, walked barefoot on hot land, when my fingers have been berry stained, or when the oily ulican has touched my lips. When I read my granny's words, roots reaching back through time. When I hear my language spoken, ping, ping, sparkle, sparkle, the hairs on my arms prick up. Inside what is me, DNA stretches towards the sum of knowing, like a yogi's morning sun salutation. My genes come alive when I note the census line that reads R is for red. When my family names erupt on residential school registers. My cognizant soul strikes and recoils, a gross of scars back to the Salish Sea, to be bathed in glory, back to buttery softness, like amber leather against my cheek, riding the backs of silver salmon. Suffering devolves and dissolves like my effervescent polydent and becomes part of the balance of my later life. My genes come alive and sparks start my dreams, where elders unfurl to speak. I watch a way to do things, weaving and breathing in other realms, where spores live in mossy beds. I receive the seasons there and I learn that dance. I live in this new place. I am alive, and the skin I shed becomes the land. The
Wow.
end.
Wow.
Thank you.
Beautiful.
You're
Beautiful.
nice.
Beautiful. Even though Jen and I come from two completely different cultures and life experiences, there are parallels to our stories. We both have a need to know our history, to reconcile with the darkest part of our family's history, to make peace with ourselves. It's through sharing our stories and unearthing the truth that we begin to heal and can then move on to help heal the wider community through our stories. I just want to say thank you, everyone. And if there's any more questions for Jen or myself, have at it.
Yeah, have at it.
So good, Jen.
Thank you. Hang on to this, Vala. I'll put it down there for you. You can take it and read it as you like. Just 1 second. There you go. You can copy and paste and read as you like. Christine, you had a question?
Okay. Yeah, I had put it in the chat, but Ms. Heige, I imagine you get this question before. I would guess you did, but and maybe if you do, you're tired of answering it. But in the do people ask you that when they're from the United States, did they ever ask you if what you see going on here in the last year, 2 years, in terms of the polarization and what I see as very much cult-like behavior from people following Trump. And like you had said earlier tonight, that there were people that were, the ability of people to get into a cult and to relinquish their own their sense of self. And so I'm blabbering, but do you see
Similarities?
Do you see any similarities? Yeah.
A whole bunch. So it was actually really scary for me when I was writing because when the amount of research that I did, I started to see patterns. And I was really able to see how a government slowly divides the individual, its society, to come to power. And so for me, there was the playbook, the Nazi playbook was being used. And I found that extremely disheartening that people were going to the levels that they were and are, and not understanding how you destroy democracy. So there's definitely patterns that are in play now, whether it's here, not dealing with issues and things that are going on in the States, for sure. Just a lot of the divide and using violence and derogatory terms, propaganda. There's so much information coming from all over the place that you don't know what to listen to. So the agenda is, I think, to confuse you and not be able to trust and to have fear of your neighbors, which when you cannot have friendly stranger conversation, you start to be isolated, and you start to, I think it's human nature to want to connect with like-minded people. But what starts to happen, and I saw a lot of that during COVID as well, the loss of communal spaces. And communal spaces, so often that's where we have friendly stranger conversation. And when you don't have that, friendly stranger conversation is how we keep democracy alive, because we share, just like what Jenn and I are doing. We are sharing in our experiences and finding common ground. And again, if you can't share stories, then what? You're left to your own devices. And when you're isolated, you're isolated. And that is a way of separating people from themselves. Does that answer your question?
It does. Yeah. And the suffering, it festers inside and becomes, other things happen. Yeah. As a result.
Any other questions? Hi, go ahead.
Oh, sorry.
I don't know how to pronounce your name.
Oh, it's okay. It's Meharuna.
Meharuna. Okay.
Yes. Yeah. Both of you have read so beautifully and talked so openly, you sharing your stories. And the question I have is more from the I guess it's I don't know if it's the craft sense, but it's more, these are such personal stories, and there's a lot of emotion and vulnerability. I'm curious to know what each of you do for yourselves in terms of some kind of, for lack of a better word, strategy of self-care as writers who are being open and with your stories that leads to a lot of vulnerability and triggering. So yeah, my question is, how do you create some kind of self-care for yourselves through the writing after you've written your pieces? I'm sure you go through some moment of processing that.
Heige, do you want to take that one first?
Sure. This morning, as Jenn and I are getting ready, we're talking back and forth. I'm like, can't talk right now. I'm out swimming. In the morning, I love going swimming in the ocean. And so that's a place where I take time and just breathe and disconnect and feel connected to greater things than myself. And friends, one of my best friends, I have conversations with her and my husband around things of how I'm feeling. And a big thing is actually having trust and being able to be honest about how you're feeling and not being judged, even when you're saying things that might not be correct. politically. We have to be able to have discourse and be able to make mistakes, because that's how we organize our thoughts. And another thing that I do is I paint. I'm a folk artist, outside artist. All the pictures on the wall.
Yes.
I love drawing people that I love, their images. So I do that, and writing, and just sharing in story. And gardening, cooking, walking. What about you, Jen?
Same as you, all of those things, gardening and my dog and painting. And I don't know if you can see mine.
Wow.
Yeah.
And what else do? I make regalia. I weave wool. I work with wool right from the sheep to the finished product. Spinning and weaving. I weave cedar. I speak with elders and I learn from them, and that's really where I find a huge connection, because of course they've been through it all, and they're really my support through all of this coming home process.
Nice.
Because they've been there before, and we all have to come home in different ways, and they've all been very open. And then I have a lot of baths, and I also hit my yoga mat pretty often. So those things. And I like to try all kinds of new stuff too. I'm a student, so when all else fails, I'll bury myself in a library and study history. It's my favorite thing to do.
Yeah. Hey, Jen, I was just wondering, what are some of the things that you've unearthed about your family history? I think you had mentioned something about Stanley Park.
Yeah, well, my family is from there, from Lumberman's Arch, from Kwai Kwai. My my granny is one of my grannies is August Jack Quetzalano's auntie, so he's our cousin. He was our cousin. My two of my grannies were in a big trial in Vancouver a long time ago, when they were trying to remove everybody from Stanley Park. And that's where I was able to read my granny's words, which was incredibly meaningful, because we're separated by, she had passed 20 years before I was born. So being able to read her words in that court document was just amazing. And I think the other thing that I've learned is that I'm related to just about everybody on the North Shore here, which is really awesome. So those are some pretty big finds. Things like finding that, one of my grannies had their portrait painted by a very famous artist and is now in a big collection was another kind of cool thing. And yeah, it's been a huge journey trying to tie all these loose ends back up and find where everything fits together, but we've made it.
Nice.
Yeah, thank you for asking. Kathleen, you had a question?
Hi, everybody. Thank you very much for this whole time in storytelling. It's very enriching for me, and I'm appreciating all the different perspectives that are here. I've been listening very, very intently. I'm a master's student at the University for Peace, which was founded by the United Nations, recognizing that's a colonial structure. And I'm in a degree called Indigenous Science and Peace Studies. And what it's about is it's funded by a network of elders from all over the world, Indigenous elders. And it's for anybody who wants to enter the program, and primarily they're settlers. There's 2 people of the 6 in my class who have 1 Indigenous parent, say for example, and I myself am a settler on all sides of my family. And what I'm listening for is a lot of the stories that you've told are exactly pertinent to the struggles that we are facing and they're asking us to face in ourselves, and then go write a thesis about it. Like I have to hand it in by December or approximately, that time frame. I'm asking for an extension to, this spring or, something like it, but fairly immediate. You kind of get it. And so I'm appreciating and there's two German women, younger women in my class. And so they were speaking about their grandparents and parents and their generation and all the differences about the Holocaust and that piece. And then, of course, we heard a lot from different Indigenous people and how their stories are so different, similar and different all over the world about what's happening currently. And so I'm appreciating this conversation, that there's two sides to this in terms of, who has guilt and in what way, and who was harmed and in what way, and looking at intergenerational trauma on both sides, and so one of the premises that they talked about is that which kind of blew my mind. Like I would say I'm born in Canada. I was 48, and I would say I'm a pretty average Canadian, at least. I don't know what that means exactly. Like everybody is so different, but in the sense of I wasn't really aware that how much of what happened in terms of genocide here in Canada, it wasn't taught to us, and that's a part of the undoing and things like that. So they're talking to us about how we all come from Indigenous peoples, everybody on the planet. It just matters how far back our ancestors stopped living in an Indigenous way.
Yes.
And I fully understand that statement could be very, very triggering for some people, and having to stand in that. And yet these are what the Indigenous elders are teaching us. And to go back to our own lineages, back, learn the stories, as much as I can trace, like you guys are talking about in my own family and the stories. And then for what I can't trace, just looking at what I can find in terms of history, like over 15,000 years, what happened in Europe? Why are there only sort of two groups that I know of, at least currently, with Indigenous status? And all of the other ones are completely wiped out, and you can barely find the names of them, and things like this. And that's my mother's side. Those are my ancestors. That is, and that is there's legacy for all of us. I'm the descendant of the descendant of the descendant of the descendant who is forgotten, who is traumatized, who doesn't even know that I have a homeland or a language or a culture, or there's something called an elder that I could or my people used to have. And how far back was that? And trying to reconcile, speaking of reconciliation, that pain, and then and in which way, and knowing also that as a settler, I have responsibility for what happened on these lands. Even, I was born in 1975, but what is my role now? And I think that's a part of, there's so many layers to reconciliation. And both of you have spoken to many of them, and it's very powerful. And I'm thinking, in story, people can speak and be heard in their words, in their way, in their language. You have to process what happened to be able to speak it. You can just listen and say thank you. You can hear what is similar and what is not in a non-violent way, and begin to have compassion in a non-violent way. And like, what is the mechanism of story that does that? Because I've been wondering how much story do I write? In my thesis.
Do you have a question?
Yeah.
Like, I loved your dialogue. What is your question?
Thank you. Yeah. So how far back did you research? Number one. So I heard your stories with the generationals. And did you go, say, for Europe, did you go further back to go, where did this start from, such that we could even end up in some of the things that we talked about today?
Right.
And then the second part is, because I'm in Canada, what are your thoughts on the state of Canada? Of course, there's truth and reconciliation happening, but it's very different than the US. They don't necessarily know what's happening in Canada. Some of the Americans that I've spoken to. So, what's your impression of reconciliation there?
So is, so for me, one of the things that I did, I started to research my last name. And that was really interesting because I took it back actually to 300 BC, the origin of my name. And in that, I found that Boehm actually comes from the tribe Boii, which was one of the largest 8 Celtic tribes in Europe at the time. And they were both a warring and a farming community. And so I was able to trace the name. And I think if you're trying to figure out how far, where do you go? I mean, I was able to go to 300 BC by my father's last name. So that is a really great way of unearthing and discovering part of your ancestry. And for me, I know when I did that, all of a sudden I felt like, wow, I actually belong to something much greater than I had ever thought I could. What about you, Jen?
Well, I went as far back as one of my grandmothers, who was at St. Mary's Residential School. At first I was just grasping at straws and taking any little lead I could find. But then once we found all the families' names on all the registers, and once finally people started to talk in my family about it because there'd been so much pain, nobody was talking.
Did you start that conversation, Jen?
Yeah, I started a Facebook for the entire family, a Facebook group, and invited everybody I could find to join.
How many people?
33.
That's great.
And counting.
Wonderful.
And so the stories that started coming out, the photos, but the stories were just incredible stuff. And all the family had never heard each other's stories and their connections and going to the reserve, and it was just gold. But what I found, and I'll say this really quickly, is that we didn't know my granny's birth name. We only knew her Christian given name that she'd been given at school. So through all my research, what I found was her name, Siamalot.
Siamalot. What a beautiful name.
So that was it was pretty epic to find that. And that's really how we found our way home, because we found out all about her, and the band office has just been amazing. And so I have to say
so you work with the band office. Sorry, the band office, they have a lot of the registry of people, or
they do have some, but not all. This stuff I found out on my own. Nobody knew this. This was gone to history. It was a fluke find in an old newspaper article in the 30s. So yeah, so I didn't go that far back, but I know how far back we go now. Really far.
What's it like for you when you walk through Stanley Park?
I was always drawn to Stanley Park as a kid. I learned how to swim at Lumberman's Arch, and I was always drawn there. We used to skip school, and that's where we would go. And
me too.
We would go, and oh my God, did I know you there? Maybe.
Yeah.
But yeah, I was always drawn to
skateboarded
that.
together.
Probably. I was drawn to that place all the time. So it's always felt like home to me, always. And now I know that it was our home.
Wow.
I wonder, we're getting short on time here. I just wanted to say thanks to everybody so much for all your questions. And also, Heige, do you have stuff that's coming up for you? I'm just putting a link in the chat here of what I've got coming up in September, October. And I'll put my website also if anybody wants to grab it.
I'll put my my website on, and no, not really. I'm working at writing and teaching students how to write, so that's a big part of what I'm doing right now. And just finishing my novel and starting a third one, and doing landscaping. That's my project. Anyone want to help? And yeah, that's I don't really have anything right now, not that I can think of.
Well, then, can I just ask you, which one should I ask you? What are you reading this summer?
Oh, so I mostly read research books. And what am I reading? Oh, 2 books: Harvest of Despair, Life and Death in Ukraine Under Nazi Rule by Karl C. Berkhoff, and The Shoah in Ukraine History, a Testimony Memorialization, edited by Ray Brandon and Wendy Lauer. That's my summer read.
Nice.
What about
I'm reading Tintin and Asterix.
what was the last book you ordered?
Oh, I just ordered our good friend Elizabeth Toman's new chapbook called Our Cadaver, which we've been workshopping with her for a very long time now, and it's finally in print, and I'm just so excited to get it in my hand.
That is so good.
It's on
Nice.
Amazon if anybody wants it. Our
Oh, that's
Cadaver.
nice, nice. My last book that I ordered was Nazi Women of the Third Reich, Serving the Swastika, by Paul Rowland, and Women of the Third Reich, From Camp Guards to Combatants by Tim Heff.
That sounds certainly like beach reading to me.
What authors influenced you, Jen?
Oh, I've got a bajillion on my list, but always at the top of my list are Douglas Adams, because I love Long Dark Tea Time of the Soul. Michael Crichton, Jurassic World, I read it every year. Anne Patchett, The Dutch House, I have it on tape, read by Tom Hanks. Oh my God, you got to listen to that.
I'm gonna.
And Wabryce for Moon of the Crusted Snow. They're just all such awesome storytellers, so I would definitely grab those ones. What authors influenced you? Quick, we've only got 3 minutes.
Okay, well, a lot, but mostly Slaughterhouse-Five by Kurt Vonnegut, and Hitler's Furies, German Women in the Nazi Killing Fields by Wendy Lauer.
Nice.
So it goes.
Excellent. Well, I guess that's it. Thank you, everybody, so much. I see we've lost some people. Oh, too bad. Maybe they'll watch the recording of it to catch up. But thank you, everybody that
Thank
came
you.
and
I want to say it's so tremendously generous of you to share with us, to take this time. You have to be so busy, as we all are, but you in particular, thank you for writing, and thank you for being so generous.
Thank you
Yeah,
so much for doing this.
we've had this conversation so many times, and we thought it was time to share with somebody, because we can talk ourselves blue in the face, but it doesn't matter if no one's listening.
So even, you know, these kinds of things are so great because you can use them to promote and just share more information as well. So thank you so much, everyone, for taking part. And Massy and Jen, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Massy, and thank you, Jackie, for everything.
You're so welcome. Thank you both. I'm gonna stop the recording now. Thank you.
Nice.